Hello and welcome to Retro 48K for my review of Final Fantasy X. Final Fantasy X is, it's for me the last truly great Final Fantasy game. It's the last one that had Sakaguchi-san sort of involved in. In 2001 he retired from Square mainly due to the poor reception of that CG film they did, and it just box office bombing. And while he was credited on several games afterwards, he actually left Square in 2001. So for me, this is kind of it's the last game which had his original vision for the series influence in it. And it's the last game that truly felt like a traditional JRPG. From this point onwards, I think Square would slowly move away from what I see as traditional JRPG, just tropes and features, not just in the combat systems, which always changed in Final Fantasy games, but in just the structure of the game and everything alongside that. They slowly moved away from Final Fantasy 15, for example, feels very much like a more open world influence game. Final Fantasy 11 felt very much like something that was influenced by MMOs rather than JRPGs, and Final Fantasy 16 feels much more like a Western style RPG to me and not a JRPG. So this is the last sort of traditional and for me truly great JRPG, and that's not just because it has those tropes in there, but I think it does a lot of things just at some points probably the best in the series at some of the things that this game does. But I'm getting way ahead of myself there. Let's first look into the different parts of the game and I'll explain why, for me, this stands out as one of the highlights of the Final Fantasy series. So first up, you can't talk about RPGs without discussing the plot and story of the game. And for me, while not the best in the series, I think it is up there in terms of the general story of this one. You start the game as Tidus, or Tidus, however you want to pronounce it. He is a young cocksure blitzball player, which is a local sport in this really futuristic looking city of Zanarkand, and then this big monster kaiju thing attacks called Sin and pulls him into a portal. He's then transported 1,000 years into the future, where the world is completely unrecognisable, and he fakes amnesia in order to get by and ends up on this journey with a young summoner called Yuna, who is destined to fight Sin, and her journey is going through various temples to get increasingly more powerful Aeons, which are basically summons in the Final Fantasy universe. So as she collects these Aeons and gets these more and more powerful ones, the hope is that she'll be able to fight and beat Sin. And this has happened for 1,000 years. Sin has never been destroyed. The summoners before her have come, beat Sin, there's a calm, and then the cycle repeats itself. And the game is very much has themes along that in terms of the repeating cycles and the religion of Spira and the influence religion has on people's lives. Without being wholly preachy about that, it does bring up some nice points around that. And as typical with a Final Fantasy game, it's not just about visit each temple in turn that is in there, but the story branches off. While it is a fairly linear game, you do get diversions in the story and interesting twists along the way, and it does, for me, I think it's pretty well told. There's a nice, not twist, but there's a nice reveal towards the end as to what actually Tidus' importance is here. What is interesting is the way they twist that amnesia trope. It's not a new thing to have a character not remember things, so that when other characters explain the way the world works to them, it sounds more natural than people having conversations where you think, well, they would already know that because they live in that world. With Tidus being transported to the future, he doesn't know it, so he fakes the amnesia. So it's a nice twist on, yeah, we're going to use that amnesia trope in order to explain the world to the viewer, but the character doesn't really have amnesia, so we're going to twist it on its head. And it's a nice way they do that, so that it doesn't feel as dated as other uses of it. But it also, there's a few nods and winks there to, Tidus at one point says he's sick of using that excuse. It's just nice little nods to it there. But then you've got character development. It's not a series highlight in terms of character development. The Final Fantasy series to me has always stood out for great moments of character development. I think back to Red 13 in Final Fantasy 7 and him finding out what his father actually fought for and died for, or in Cosmos Canyon, or Barret and Dyne and their dynamic and that change of Barret through the series, or Vivi and his confrontation of mortality in Final Fantasy IX. These were all great sort of character development moments that really stood out to me. This game kind of has that with the Wakka character immediately jumps out, and his change from a almost quite zealotry in terms of his dogmatic following of the religion to his becoming more questioning attitude, and Yuna's growth from quite a naive initially, my duty calls this sort of, I don't know, sacrifice and all this kind of stuff, started to her growing to be more of an independent character. They are more subtle growths in this one though. They don't have those standout big character change moments of a big impact on them. It's more of a subtle change across the journey, which you could argue is probably more realistic. But in general, the story is pretty good. It's up there with some of the best. It's certainly not the worst story in there. It's got some really memorable moments and memorable characters in there, and some nice side characters. But it's not what makes it top tier for me. But it's still very enjoyable. There is some glaring plot issues, however, I think that's what stops it from being the top. It's not going to spoil anything for me to say that in this world in Spira, when characters die, they have to be sent to the far plane. The summoners will perform a dance and send them to the far plane. And later on, I won't spoil which characters, but you find some characters have died in the past and just refused to go to the far plane and just hung around, and that kind of reduces the stakes. It's like, right, well, so what you're saying there is if you die, then you can just go, well, I'm just going to carry on as if I wasn't killed, and you just carry on. Now, the way the plot adds the danger of death back in is that you run the risk of becoming a fiend and becoming resentful by doing that, and that's what the fiends are in the world, the people that have died and not been sent and become resentful of the living. But again, there's no sign of that in some of the characters that have done this. It would have been nice if they'd shown some sort of signs of turning into that or something along those lines. I won't say, some of them have, but I won't say which ones, because again, I'm not showing footage of that, because if you haven't played this, I don't want to spoil those reveals. But it is death is a core theme of this plot, and it just feels like they maybe could have thought that one through a bit better to keep the stakes high. But generally, I think the plot is very memorable and well worth your time and attention. You also can't discuss a Final Fantasy game without talking about the music. Uematsu's scores are just legendary in the Final Fantasy series. There's so many standout tracks. Overall, I think Final Fantasy VII has got the best overall soundtrack, but there's tracks in 8 and 9, and even some of the later games that just really stand out. And then you've got even the early Super Nintendo ones and NES ones had really memorable and beautiful tracks in them that when you hear full orchestra versions of the 8-bit tunes just really enrich them. This was the first game in the series that he actually had help and assistance with, and I think actually brings out the best of him. The core theme of Final Fantasy X is just a slow piano piece that is really poignant and really fits in with the mood of the game. And then you've got the other music that kind of fits in with this. It's a very the style of the game seems very South Pacific, sort of Indonesian, that island theme to it because of a lot of the water themes in here, and it fits very in keeping with that without feeling too surfer duty, if that makes sense. I think it really does fit, and it is a really memorable plot. And one of the key things about Final Fantasy VII, any sort of Final Fantasy game or any sort of JRPG, is it's got a really solid battle and boss theme, because those are the themes that you are going to be hearing over and over and over and over again as you do those fights. And to this day, I'm not sick of hearing those battle themes, and they stick with you. So from a music point of view, this is a top tier Final Fantasy game for me. Next up, before I get onto the really big things about Final Fantasy series, I think talking about sort of endgame content and side quests is important. JRPGs always stood out over Western RPGs for me is because a lot of the side quests are very intrinsic to the plot. It's never the side quests that you get in Western ones where it's, you know, go and kill 30 sheep to get 6 of these things. They tend to be very plot driven, and this is no different. There is side quests to find all the different Aeons in the game, and I actually recommend when you're doing the temples in the game, make sure you spend the time to find all the spheres in them, because you get one of the best Aeons late game, and if you try and get back into those temples later on in the game, there are usually blocked by Dark Aeons, which are, if you think of the weapons in the Final Fantasy VII series, these are like super hard bosses that are harder than the last boss in the game, that are optional, that really test your skills, and you really have to focus on the getting your leveling up and getting fully maxed out characters to even stand a chance of beating these guys. I mean, I have characters on my save that are 9,999 life, etc., and these guys are just one-hitting them because I haven't got my strength up to match that. So there's loads of sub-bosses to beat that again fit with those plots. There's monster side quests where you hunt monsters to sell to a farm, and then again he creates weird and wonderful creations which create even more special bosses for you to fight. There's the secret weapons, and you know, each ultimate weapon in the game has multiple factors to unlock its full attributes. So you'll pick a weapon up and you'll think it's rubbish, but it's actually the ultimate weapon, and by finding a couple of items and then unlocking them against the weapon, you suddenly get a full suite of tools, a full suite of like a really powerful weapon to start using there. So there's all little hidden things like that. There are a couple of annoying mini games in there, chocobo racing and things that feel more luck based than anything else, where you've got to hit, like, pop balloons and things like that. But generally, I think the mini games and side quests here are, I've probably spent more time on this than a lot of the Final Fantasy series. Like 7 is my favourite in the series, and I would still put the side quests in this above the side quests in 7. That's how good I think the side quests are in here. And the other side quest that I forgot to mention is Blitzball. This is a full-on mini-game. It's kind of like a cross between rugby but water polo and underwater, and is very stats heavy. You will have to play this a lot if you want to unlock the best limit breakers / overdrives. I'll get onto that when I do the combat system. You'll have to play this a lot if you want to unlock the best of those for Waka, because you have to play. I've ended up playing about 50 Blitzball games in order to get my characters up and unlock all those features. Because some of the prizes are random, so you might not have to do that many, but around about 40 to 50 you probably end up playing. So you spend a lot of time with this, but again, that it fits into that narrative, because at a point in the game, like, some of the characters are Blitzball players, and you can talk to other people in the world and actually hire them for your Blitzball team to play as, so you don't have to spend a lot of time leveling them up if you pick the right characters. I recommend trying to get Brother when you get access to the Al Bhed ship. Brother is an absolute top tier character and really levels up fastly and has great attributes and special abilities to really help you out, along with Tidus, who has the Jack shot and things like that, to make that side quest so much easier. I think a lot of people will get annoyed with Blitzball because you move to a place, the game works out, you have a stat for like defense, they'll tackle you, it'll knock your defense stat down, or if it goes down to 0, they'll take the ball off you. Or if you don't try and tackle them and you just try and shoot or pass, they'll block. That might take some of your passing stat down. So if you've got 30, they might block at 15, dropping it to 15, and therefore the pass doesn't get through to the player. It is very numbers based, and there's a random element to it, which can sometimes be frustrating as hell. So I think Blitzball is one of those love it or hate it style mini games. Some people will, some people won't. So now on to the biggie, and that's combat. And for me, this is what Final Fantasy X does the best. It is probably my favourite combat system in the Final Fantasy series, just because I find it so it's so intuitive as a user to use. That sounds awful, but it is. The big change here over the previous ones, it's no longer the active time battle system. It's a change here to, down the right hand side of the screen, you will see the battle order of inputs. So in real time you can see, if I select this character, then I'm actually going to get 2 goes here because it fits 2 in before the boss gets, or you can see when each enemies going to attack, so you can plan your attacks a lot more strategically. If you are up against 3 monsters and monster A is going to go first and then monster B, and then you've got 2 more goes before monster C attacks, you can focus your first 3 attacks on monster A's and B, and if you get them killed, then you're going to get those other 2 attacks in before C, so you can be a lot more strategic about the way you fight. And it's also the way enemies are structured here now also forces you to use the team to your advantage, which is the other big change on this. You can now change your party on the fly within the battle. You can just press a button and pull pull one of your backline characters in and start fighting with them as well. And if you pick the traditional spear grid, I'll come on to the upgrade system in a minute. If you pick the traditional spear grid, it's very job system based. Characters start in places on that will make one a mage, one a powerful battle liner, one an agile distance flyer character that takes on flyers, one a thief, one a jack of all trades, one your healer. They're very much those kind of job scenarios. So, and the way they structure enemies in a lot of cases builds into that, so you'll be running along and you might find that you're fighting 3 enemies. One is a fast and agile land enemy that you need Tidus to attack, otherwise when Wakka tries to aim at him, he's got high accuracy but they keep getting dodged. You'll have flyers that need Wakka to take out, and then you might have a magic enemy that needs Lulu to cast fire against because the other physical attacks aren't good. Or you might have a really strong armoured enemy that you need Orin to attack and use power break on to debuff that character so the other can attack it. And they fit enemies together really nicely to force you to use your different characters and to play as all of them and to bring them in and drop them back and things like that. The Aeon system here also helps and fits into that. A lot of when you initially start the game, you'll be using the Aeons, the summons in traditional Final Fantasy language, to call in the big beasts, do a big attack. The way they work is they get hit a few times and they attack a few times, they build up their overdrive gauge and then unleash a massive blast attack that does big damage. Towards the end of the game, when you're doing a lot of damage yourself, you actually don't need them to do that anymore, but what you end up using them for is when you sense a big attack's coming, when there's a countdown coming and you can see on that side of the screen that you've got 3 more goes. On your last go, you'll bring an Aeon in and just have him take the hit for you so you don't kill your characters, and then they come back in and you can keep fighting. So it adds that layer of strategy to it as well, which works really well and fits in with that use of characters and pulling them in. It's also the like I said, that structure of enemies. It's one of the few Final Fantasy games where I found I had to use everything in my arsenal. I couldn't just power through by going, oh well, I've got these 3 everyman characters that I've made really balanced and things. You have to have that character who can do power breaks and can do magic breaks and can really knock an enemy's defenses down or debuff a particular attack so that the other characters can survive long enough to do the damage. You've got to really think about that with a lot of the way the battles are set up and a lot of the enemy types that you come across. And a lot of the footage that I'm showing late game is just me absolutely pounding through because I've filled the full upgrade grid and I've got everyone to that balance point. But the journey to that is really fun, and it solves that problem that a lot of the Final Fantasy games can sometimes have, or little JRPGs where the combat starts off really simple and then you get some interesting fights here and there, but generally the normal mob enemies are just not interesting to fight. You're just hitting them and then moving on, hitting them and then moving on. Generally most fights are interesting unless you spend so long in an area that you completely overpower them, but that's your choice to do if you're getting stuck. Now, I've mentioned Sphere Grid a few times there, and a lot of you might be wondering what the hell I'm talking about. So the way the levelling up system works in Final Fantasy X is that you start on, you get a grid, and at the start of the game you can choose between the advanced or the basic. I'd recommend the basic if it's your first time through. The advanced one does take a bit more forward planning, and so until you get used to it, you might want to. You can't switch mid-game, unfortunately, so depends how hard you want to make the start of the game for yourself. But the way the grid works, it's actually it's the most linear upgrade system apart from maybe 13 within the Final Fantasy series. As you do fights, you gain experience and you get sphere levels, and you also pick up spheres like power spheres and mental and different and attribute spheres. You use your sphere levels to move around the grid, and then you use the spheres that you pick up from enemies and doing battles to fill the holes on that grid. So you might move 3 places, and then either side of that you've got 2 power ones, one that gives you 200 health, one that gives you +1 attack, and you fill them in, and you slowly move around the grid until you max that up. And they mix it up by having, occasionally you'll get branching paths on that grid, or you'll get one where if you've got an unlocked sphere you can go down a different route, and they try and mix it up with that. But it is fairly linear. You are just basically moving around a grid, and sometimes you might go, well, I can't go down that route, so I'll go down this route, and then later on you might have to use sphere levels to go back so you can go down the other route. Thankfully, when you go back you can move 4 times as fast as when you go forward, but it still does mean it can be a bit grindy towards the end to fully fill this out. As you can see, some of the footage I'm showing, I've got quite far into it and still not fully. I'm about 100 hours in on this save, I think, and I still haven't maxed that grid out, mainly because I've been doing other things with them. But you get the idea. It looks open and it feels more open than it is when you sit down and think about it. It does feel like the leveling system is quite fixed. But this is how you unlock new abilities for characters as well. So different abilities will be in different places, and there'll be paths through that sphere grid that are more mage focused, and paths through that are more knight focused in traditional jobs for Final Fantasy and other RPGs. And like I said, this standard sphere grid is more fixed to that. The advanced one, you can pick your paths a bit better, and each character will start in different places to make them more akin to that role. But having said that, most Final Fantasy leveling up systems are fairly linear. If you think of 7 and 9, etc., you just gain experience and then level up naturally, and your abilities come from your materia on that, whereas this is directly tied to where you are on that sphere grid. So that people will have different opinions of how linear that truly is, based on your expectations of how that should work. And that kind of brings me to the end of the review. For me, Final Fantasy X will always have a place in that sort of top tier of Final Fantasy games, and that top tier of JRPGs. The music and combat system alone deserve it to be up there. Like I said, the plot, different people will have different reactions, and I think it will mainly depend on how much those plot holes bother you, or how much the themes of the game resonate with you, and how much you enjoy that aesthetic. Graphically, I think it still holds up today. I'm showing you the HD version here. They used a mix of still using some of the pre-rendered backgrounds with animations set on them, like full motion video, etc., embedded in the background, and then fully 3D environments. And it's the first to use properly fully 3D environments, and they do some nice camera work on that to make use of it, but it's still a mixture of the two. The voice acting, I think there's some very corny lines, but generally it's pretty good, and it uses actually some of the Futurama cast, if memory serves. So there's some quality skills on display there. And unlike, I found that in Final Fantasy XI, the follow-on from this, the voice acting suffered from the compression they used. They had to really compress it to get on the disc. And you lost a lot of that nuance in some of the voice acting. This doesn't suffer from that as much, because there's not as much fully voiced in this. There's some of the side characters is just text-based talking. There are some frustrating elements. I've said to it, a lot of people will hate stuff like the lightning dodging minigame and things like that. So that's going to be down to your personal preference on that one. I personally think, like I said, this is a top tier Final Fantasy game, and I recommend everyone should still play it. It holds up well today. The aesthetics look good. It was a really standout game at the time on the PS2 when it was launched. It was up there with sort of the Metal Gear Solid 2 sort of top end of it. Really detailed character models in places. Sometimes there's a weird graphical thing on here where sometimes they'll use lower poly models in scenes, and I can't work out why that is, because some of the times there's only a couple of characters on screen, and I'm not sure why they've used the lower poly model than the higher poly model, because you can tell by the faces sometimes. Tidus is a prime example. Sometimes his face will have very, very stoic like ones, and then sometimes it's a much higher model one and you'll see much more facial expression from him. And I think it must just be a director's choice on which are the more emotional scenes on that one for which they've used, and cost-cutting measures, I can only assume. But like I said, what do you guys think? For me, it's a top tier Final Fantasy game, and I definitely recommend picking up today. You've got the HD re-release, which is a great way of playing it because you get it, that and X2, which is a kind of pseudo sequel to this that is a spin-off on some of the female characters on it. But I'd love to hear what you think. Let me know in the comments. Is this one of your favourite Final Fantasy games or favourite JRPGs? And if not, why not? But until next time, I've been Retro48K. I'll see you in my next video.